The conman with a shovel and treasures from a suitcase in 1873, the world held its breath, captivated by news from northwestern Turkey. A dubious businessman named Heinrich Schliemann, who decided in his later years to play archaeologist, announced he had discovered the legendary city of Troy. Before a crowd of reporters, he triumphantly placed a golden funeral mask on a pedestal, boldly proclaiming it the Mask of Agamemnon. Soon after, his wife Sophia paraded before cameras, adorned with ancient trinkets that her enterprising husband confidently dubbed the jewels of Helen. The spectacle was capped by the so-called Priam's treasure. The public was ecstatic. It all seemed true. Helen of Troy, Paris, King Priam, the Trojan War. All of it was real. From that moment, right up to the cheesy Hollywood blockbuster Troy in 2004, where pretty actors competed in pouting, the fascination with the Trojan War has never faded, fueled by a widespread belief that this epic tale has a real foundation. Don't miss the secrets we're uncovering. Subscribe and hit the like button to join our journey into ancient mysteries. The problem is, this belief rests on a foundation laid by one of history's grandest archaeological hoaxers. Heinrich Schliemann was no scholar. He was a shrewd traveling salesman and stock market speculator who amassed a fortune through anything he could get his hands on. From saltpeter and indigo to supplying shoddy military equipment during the Crimean War. Retiring as a multimillionaire, he decided to invest his wealth in a childhood dream, to find the city described in the Iliad. His methods matched his commercial cunning. Hiring hundreds of workers, he ruthlessly dug into the hill of Hisarlik, where he calculated Troy lay. He had no interest in cultural layers or meticulous work. Armed with a pickaxe, shovel, and even dynamite, he blasted his way to what he believed were the deepest, most ancient layers. In the process, he irreparably destroyed the very cultural layer known as Troy VIIa, that modern archaeologists consider the most likely candidate for Homer's Troy. Those who worked with Schliemann later revealed that most of his headline-grabbing discoveries were either hastily crafted by local artisans or found at entirely different sites and secretly brought to Hisarlik for a dramatic unveiling before the press. The famous Mask of Agamemnon wasn't even found in Troy, but in Mycenae, and modern dating methods show it was created about 300 to 400 years before the supposed time of the Trojan War. It belonged to some nameless Mycenaean chieftain, but the name of a great king made for far juicier headlines. Priam's treasure was essentially a mishmash of items from different layers, which Schliemann bundled together for maximum effect as a single treasure. He smuggled it out of the Ottoman Empire, hidden in vegetable baskets. His entire endeavor was one giant publicity stunt, with himself as both producer and star, and ancient history merely a backdrop for his vanity. Homer, blind storyteller or collective pseudonym. All information about the Trojan War stems, essentially from one source, two epic poems, the Iliad and The Odyssey, attributed to a figure named Homer. The problem is, we don't know if this person ever existed. No reliable biographical details about him survive. Ancient sources themselves were confused, naming 7 different cities as his birthplace and describing him as either sighted or blind. Modern scholarship leans toward the Homeric Question, which debates whether Homer was a real person or a collective pseudonym for a host of bards who, over centuries, passed down heroic tales orally. Even if we assume Homer was a historical figure, a far more serious issue arises. By conventional dating, he lived and composed around the 8th century BCE. Yet the events he describes, with such vivid detail, the Trojan War, are believed to have occurred around the 12th century BCE. That's a gap of 400 years between the poet and the events. It's as if a modern writer tried to vividly describe the life and battles of the 16th century, relying solely on oral traditions without written records. Over 4 centuries of oral transmission, any real event inevitably becomes layered with so much myth, embellishment, and outright fantasy that separating fact from fiction becomes impossible. The original event, if it happened at all, might have been a minor border skirmish or pirate raid, which over time ballooned in collective memory into an epic 10-year siege involving gods and heroes. The Iliad is not a historical chronicle, but a work of art. Homer, or whoever hid behind that name, was not a historian but a poet. His goal wasn't to record facts, but to craft a compelling story, glorify ancestral valor, and entertain listeners. He boldly wove Olympian gods into the narrative, scheming, quarreling, and fighting alongside mortals. Achilles is nearly invulnerable, horses speak, and heroes hurl boulders that two modern men couldn't budge. Trying to reconstruct real events from this text is like studying French history through Alexandre Dumas' novels. It's beautiful, gripping, but only loosely tied to reality. So when we talk about the Trojan War, we're discussing not a historical fact, but a literary plot, crafted by a figure who may never have existed. 100,000 Greeks in goatskins over one girl even. If we set aside doubts about Homer and Schliemann and analyze the story in the Iliad, it crumbles under basic logic and common sense. The poem tells of a united Greek army, over 100,000 strong, sailing on more than 1,000 ships to Asia Minor to avenge the abduction of Helen, wife of Spartan king Menelaus. The kidnapper? Trojan prince Paris. The siege, according to Homer, lasts 10 years. Let's start with the motive: the abduction of a woman. Most ancient sources suggest Helen was about 12 or 13 at the time. In ancient Greece, women, to put it mildly, held little social status, barely more than prized livestock. The idea that rival Greek city-states, Athens, Sparta, Mycenae, Thebes, would unite, muster all their warriors, and embark on a decade-long overseas campaign over one girl is unthinkable. It would have been political and economic suicide. Next, the army's size. 100,000 men is a colossal figure, even for armies of the classical era, let alone the primitive 12th century BCE. Gathering, arming, transporting across the sea, and, most critically, feeding such a horde for 10 years would have been an insurmountable logistical challenge. If every able-bodied Greek man sailed to Turkey for a decade, they'd return to find no Greece left. Their lands would have been seized by neighboring tribes, their families starved. And finally, the warrior's appearance. Thanks to Hollywood, we picture Achilles and Hector in gleaming bronze armor and crested helmets. In reality, warriors of that era looked far humbler. Bronze was an incredibly costly and rare metal. A full bronze suit, like the famous Dendra panoply, was reserved for kings and top chieftains. Most warriors fought in, at best, quilted linen tunics, with wicker shields and perhaps goatskin loincloths. This wasn't a clash of shining demigods, but likely a gritty skirmish between tribal militias. Thus, Homer's entire tale, from motive to scale to the warrior's appearance, is a grandiose exaggeration that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. The wooden horse. Absurdity on a 100.1 scale. The crowning jewel of this fantastical tale is, of course, the Trojan Horse, a cunning invention that became a proverb and inspired computer viruses. According to legend, the Greeks, unable to take the city by force, built a massive wooden horse hiding 40 elite warriors inside. Leaving this offering to the gods at Troy's gates, they pretended to sail away. The Trojans, in a stunning lapse of judgment, dragged the horse inside. At night, the Greeks emerged, dispatched the guards, and opened the gates for the main army, which had stealthily returned. This story is logistical and physical nonsense. Let's do the math. For a wooden horse to conceal even one person, it would need to be about twice the size of a real horse. To hide 40 warriors with their gear, it would need to be roughly 100 times larger, a structure the size of a multi-story building. How could the Greeks, using primitive Bronze Age tools, construct such a behemoth? From what materials? How much timber would they have needed? And most crucially, how could the Trojans drag this monstrosity into their city? What gates could accommodate such a beast? Even ardent defenders of Homer's historicity acknowledge the absurdity. They propose rational explanations, suggesting the horse might be a mistranslation or poetic metaphor for a siege engine, battering ram, or giant catapult. Another theory claims the horse symbolized an earthquake. Poseidon was god of both horses and quakes, which breached the walls. But these speculations are unnecessary. The Trojan horse is not a historical puzzle, but a vivid literary device, perfectly fitting the myth's framework, but utterly detached from reality. It's simply the most famous element of a war that never happened. What was really unearthed at Troy? A layered cake of disappointment. So what does the site Schliemann declared as Troy actually represent? The archaeological site at Hisarlik is essentially a layered cake of ruins from at least 9 different cities, built atop one another over more than 3 millennia. The earliest settlement, Troy VIIa, dates to around 3000 BCE, while the latest, Troy IX, was a thriving Roman city, Ilium, lasting into the Byzantine era. Obsessed with finding Homer's Troy with its broad streets and lofty towers, Schliemann dug a massive trench through the hill's center, mixing and destroying priceless archaeological layers. His Priam's treasure was found in Troy II, a layer now known to predate the supposed Trojan War by about 1,000 years, contemporary with Egypt's pyramids, not Agamemnon or Achilles. Modern archaeologists, using far more careful methods, believe that if Homer's Troy existed, it's likely in Troy VIIa. This city was destroyed by fire and warfare around 1180 BCE, the right time frame. But here's the disappointment. Troy VIIa was no grand capital of a mighty empire. It was a cramped, modest citadel, likely a refuge for nearby villagers during attacks. There were no broad streets. Houses were packed tightly, and the overall area was small. Hittite archives from the period mention a state called Wilusa in Western Asia Minor, which some scholars link to Ilium, Troy's other name. These texts reference political instability and conflicts in the region. It's possible a minor clash between Achaeans, Greeks, and Wilusa's inhabitants occurred, perhaps a pirate raid, a trade route dispute, or a small tribal war. But this mundane Bronze Age event was seized by oral tradition, embellished, inflated to epic proportions, and 400 years later, transformed into a grand saga of a decade-long war, a stolen queen and a wooden horse. Thus, we're left with a war that never was, described by a poet who may not have existed, and unearthed by a conman who, in his quest for glory, destroyed what little truth might have remained. Thanks for exploring these ancient mysteries with us. Subscribe now and like this video to dive deeper into lost civilization secrets.